right now. So any rustiness I shall attribute, and any inability to interact with humanity I shall attribute to my sabbatical right now before I begin. And what I thought I'll do today is, all of you have heard a lot about games, simulation games in particular. So I thought what will be nice to do is, and I think as Aditi was talking about it as well, as pedagogical tools is a fairly well-known subject matter as well. So what I thought would be useful is to sidestep that a little bit, talk about public policy, talk about why it's a complex matter, and where do games fit in the context of public policy. That was the idea for today. And can I share my screen?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Is this visible now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so without further ado, when we talk about public policy, what are we talking about, right? We often talk about a future that we'd like to build for. What is that future, and whose future are questions often. The picture on the left is typically what people would like to build for, whereas the reality is the two pictures on the right is where we live and how we function. Whereas most public policy is catered towards the picture on the left. What that means is ground realities are different. Your starting points are different. How do we then design something in that context? And if we are not able to do it, does it continue to be the two pictures on the right becomes something that we need to grapple with? You saw a mass of humanity in one of the pictures previously. Especially in the context of public policy, the question is also about a shared collective vision. What is this future that we keep talking about, and who are the people who are involved when it comes to this future? Because often that's where the problems arise, right? My socioeconomic background is very, very substantively different from many other people's socioeconomic background, whether it's coming from the perspective of income levels, whether it's coming from the perspective of race, whether it's coming from the perspective of gender, whether it's coming from the perspective of caste, religion. All of these factors play a role, and this is as individuals. Then when we start adding or throwing organizations, lobbying groups, for-profit entities, industries, factories, all of them into the mix, then what kind of trade-offs we'd prefer, what we'd like to see as a future in 2040, 2030. We are fairly close to 2030 now, a fairly strong day of reckoning for all of us, given that the SDGs were set out a few years ago, and we are coming to the date of when we need to take stock. So I think it's an important element because of all these differences. What tends to happen is that our own biases, our own preferences come into play, and which shape what we demand, what we need. As an example, somebody who can afford to buy a four-wheeler or a car in India is constantly clamoring for clean energy-based vehicles, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But unfortunately, when about more than 50% of India's energy still comes from coal, just changing your car to an electric car does not really change much, right? You're just moving the pollution from the city to where the energy is being generated. Vinod and I were just talking earlier about the fact that he's very close to some mines and power plants and steel plants. So we just move the pollution to another place. The source of emission changes, right? But then do we incentivize that? Do we incentivize public transport, especially in a context, again, like India, where public transport is not accessible or affordable yet? Hopefully, we'll get there one day. That's the attempt. So that's the idea of looking at collective visions. I thought we'll start off with setting the context a bit. When we talk about public policies and how policies are made and framed, one of the things that we often tend to forget is that it is a fairly complicated process, but it's also a fairly cyclical process. And in that context, what becomes lost is the nuance of what these cyclical processes are. often we can start with sort of the planning stage, which we can break down into multiple phases in itself, looking at various problems, looking at different kinds of solutions, based on which you then choose the project, and then you come up with a project specification, which then moves into the, we just going through our elections here in India, and which then goes into the legislative phase, right? I mean, which makes participating in the electoral process all the more important. So I hope everyone has already voted or is going to set out to vote. I'm happy to take questions now. Is that okay? There are 2 hands that were raised. Is that okay? If that's okay, can we have those questions, please? There were 2 hands that were raised.
I think they must have done mistakenly. You continue, please.
Okay, fine. Great. Okay. In case there are questions, please just type them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them as and when we get them. Yeah, what I was at the legislative phase, right? So we passed them through the planning process mandates, at least so far, in democratic processes, at least, that we go through the legislative process, which then looks at various institutional structures that needs to be set up, or if they need to be set up, and then moves towards the implementation phase, which is where a lot of the financing for public transport that I talked about earlier, or the case of electric vehicles that we discussed earlier, gets discussed, whether the government wants to fund it themselves, what mechanisms, what means do they have to fund it, what modes do they choose to fund it? Do they choose to set up a SVP? Do they choose to set up a public-private partnership? Do they choose to then, in terms of getting the funding for it, finance it themselves or raise money from private capital in the markets, or do they wish to borrow from international lending institutions or domestic lending institutions? Or if they have the wherewithal, do they wish to set up a funding body in itself, right? Which is often the case as well in many contexts. Then the project goes into an execution mode. There's an evaluation phase based on whether it's working well. If it's not working well, what are the modifications required? How do you modify that? The basic idea of a cyclical process. This has been created by us after a lot of necessary work, looking at various scholarly work already in the policy formulation cycle. Like I said, this is a theoretical sort of a approach, whereas in reality, this is what happens more often than not. You have some consultant coming up somewhere in today's context, either the Big Four or otherwise, telling the government what needs to happen. Testing and reformulation also does not happen, rarely happens. I'm being generous by saying testing and reformulation happens. Data analysis may or may not happen, depending on the context of the problem and depending on who's doing the policy formulation. There are substantive literature out there right now talking about how in the policy formulation process, the fact that feedback loops are being removed, the fact that public participation does not happen, and the fact that public accountability is reducing because what's happening is institutional structures are changing in such a manner that a lot of the policy formulation work is being outsourced, which means that institutional capacity also reduces in the long term. And this is a very critical problem that needs to be addressed at some point in time. Then moving on, another element when it comes to policy formulation is looking at how do you test policies, right? Here, I'm just taking one example of looking at specifically at poverty, given that's an important element across the world right now, inequality and poverty. We might start with specification of the action or policy under consideration, which then moves on to building an analytical model, whichever model that is, right? Whether it's an economic model, whether it's a socio-economic model, macroeconomic model, microeconomic model, depends on what context we're looking at, whether it's a transport model, whether it is an energy model, whether it's a climate resiliency model, depends on the context that we're looking at. Which largely draws on existing theory and looks at the data on hand. which then moves into looking at various sorts of outcomes as the first step, which then sort of leads to specifying different evaluation criteria. Now, these evaluation criteria could be derived at one step itself, or often this is a multi-step process, just because of the complexity of the problem at hand. And once these criteria are you have a baseline for the criteria, you then sort of start evaluating based on these criteria, which should ideally lead to some form of reformulation. So typically, when India still had the NSSO and the census fully functional, this was the process that was used for all social welfare schemes and all schemes that addressed inequality and poverty. So it's a fairly complex process with multiple stakeholders, with various different institutions already being involved in this process. So I've been talking about participation a bit. So I thought it might be useful to just look at what do we mean by participation and break that down into different elements so that we can also then go back and look at where do games as tools fit, where do gaming simulations fit, and do they fit at all? Are they the right medium at all in this context? So the first, to think about levels of participation, it's nice to sort of draw a scale or a spectrum, right from passive all the way to active. We can start with looking at how information is disseminated to various stakeholders, right? There's a push. Essentially, let's say, the government. Everyone else is the citizens. So I shall push information based on what is required. So then everybody becomes just passive consumers of information, right? That's being pushed by the government. The second step in that sense is I cherry pick some stakeholders because I think they're important in whatever sense of the word importance is defined. And then I collect data from them. I use that data in creating these policies. The next one is rather than just key stakeholders, we also then go on to define what are called performance indicators, either for the process in itself or the policy in itself, right? So when you start doing that with expert stakeholders setting them, these could be academics, these could be committees constituted by the government itself or in the participatory process itself. So that becomes the next level. The level after that becomes a little more intensive, which is where I think ideally most participatory levels sort of would like to sit in because of structural mechanisms or availability of structural mechanisms rather. And this level is largely where the affected stakeholders, those who are affected by the policy, for whom the policy is made. If it's, for example, policy on public transport, then people who use public transport, who are, let's say, entitled to whatever mechanisms and schemes that the government is bringing out, they are part of the group that sets the goals and evaluates the policies along with experts. So that's the next level. And the ideal level, which I would say I've seen across the world a handful of instances and not more, is where the ownership of the model, the data, and the results lie with those who are affected. This is a very, very ideal state for what is called a complete active participation in the case of public policy. And then how do we model that, or the process of public policy? And this is where people who are affected own the data. They also own the results, so they can then go on and make suggestions, modifications to these processes themselves. Now, to sort of look at, we've sort of broadly looked at what I mean by the context of public policy and what the problem is, right? Let's take a look at why gaming simulations, or do gaming simulations actually fit, and where do they fit? Typically, when you look at this is a very, very well-recognized diagram. I'm sure many of you have seen it. If not, my suggestion is please do go ahead and read Shubik. It's a wonderful read. It's really lovely for anybody working in the area. When we start looking at variables, you can sort of look at it at two axes, right? One is what are called tangible variables, and the other is what are called intangible variables. Tangible variables could be quantifiable as well. For example, money, time, number of the manpower required. All of those are tangible. There are a whole host of intangible variables as well, right? Social network, access, power. We might be able to quantify them. We might not be able to quantify them, but they're fairly intangibles. It's hard to sort of put a finger on them directly or easily without substantive work. That's the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is looking at the number of variables. So on the left-hand side, you have fewer variables, and on the right-hand side, you have more variables. And on the left-hand side, you largely deal only with quantifiable variables. On the right-hand side, you deal with unquantifiable variables, right? Variables which you can't put a number to. These are unquantifiable variables. Now, typically, when it comes to various approaches, behavioral studies fall in the bottom left quadrant because historically they have dealt very well with intangible variables, but they're largely quantifiable and they deal with fewer variables. So largely behavioral economics, for example, and a lot of game theoretic models as well, they fall in the left-hand side. This could also be, for example, multi-criteria optimization or statistical models as well, because they're able to then start dealing with more tangible variables. Because you can start looking at I mean, my criticism of optimization models have always been that they tend to optimize the wrong things. But you can create good optimization models to prioritize the right variables as well. But in this context, they can start dealing with multiple variables, and they can start dealing with a whole host of variables. As we move to the right-hand corner, the top right corner, we are looking at systems analysis and sensitivity analysis, which has become fairly ubiquitous nowadays across various disciplines. But what is still hard to do is looking at unquantifiable and intangible variables. And this is where sort of a combination of gaming simulations really help, because we can factor in how people behave, why they behave in a certain manner, and therefore what are the effects of that behavior. So this is a very, very broad idea of where do gaming simulations as a method fit in the larger scheme of things. So therefore, we talked about, if you remember, this wonderful, beautiful cycle that we talked about, very theoretical, very fancy, and very ideal. But unfortunately, in the real world, we said it doesn't happen. It's a fairly linear process. So in order to sort of talk about how do you make that linear process, push it towards the ideal world a little. That's where you can sort of use games a little bit and gaming simulations a little bit. One is to get people into the policy making process itself. The other one is to test outcomes and scenarios and then feed it back into the policy, which directly goes into this stage, right? When we talk about, I don't know if the cursor is visible. Is the cursor visible? Okay, great. Where in the planning state, right, where you have the problem identification, where you have the solutions, development of viable alternatives, analysis of current and future performance. This is where you can use gaming simulations to bring in the needs, to bring in different sections of society to participate in the process of making a policy. And then you can look at in terms of evaluation and feedback and modifications. Again, you can start using gaming simulations because of the nature of the problem at hand in both contexts, in terms of the diversity of stakeholders, in terms of the diversity of future states that people are looking at, and in terms of the nature of the variables that are being looked at. So again, just going back again to once we looked at the policy cycle, the next one again to look at is in terms of participatory modeling itself. Where do games work, right? Games, again, like as I mentioned, they work very well in scoping out problems, identifying future states, setting priorities, in envisioning with a large group of people or a small subset of people who generally don't see eye to eye, for example. In the context of, let's say, renewable energy that we are talking about, the interests of a coal-based power plant or an industry that predominantly relies on coal-based power and folks who are responsible for mining coal, or companies who are responsible for mining coal, and people who are largely, let's say, for example, in the context of India, people who are looking at solar energy. So let's say industries that are either procuring or producing PV cells, solar PV cells. And on the other hand, in order to set up these large solar plants, you need a substantive amount of land, land-owning small landholders across various geographies. All of their, if you look at all of their preferences and what future that they envision, it is going to be very different. And what they want to do is going to be at loggerheads with each other, just because of what their interests are. Now, these are just this sampling set of actors, right? There can be a whole host of other actors that I haven't even talked about. I haven't talked about all the government actors. I haven't talked about all the civil society actors, and I haven't talked about all the academic actors as well. So when you bring all of them into the space, how do you sort of figure out a future together? That becomes a question. Then how do you formulate it? What kind of tools can you create to formulate that? And then at the end, how do you evaluate these trade-offs? Once you have these different policy formulations ready, how do you at the last stage evaluate trade-offs? That's a critical element, again, with respect to games. How can you evaluate these trade-offs? Because without evaluate, it's not really a question of when I'm teaching the course on public policy, my favorite thing to say is, when choosing between different policy formulations, it's not really about which is the best one. It's about picking the poison that we'd like to live with. Right. So essentially, it's a question of trade-offs. Every policy formulation that we choose will affect different sets of people differently, some positively and some negatively, right? If you are going to prioritize renewable energy, those people, whether in various forms of livelihood, this could be miners themselves in the coal mines, this could be industrialists themselves in the coal industry, large companies, they will be affected negatively with respect to a renewable energy policy. But is that the desired trade-off that we are looking at? And if that is the desired trade-off, then you formulate that, right? So while we are looking at reducing carbon emissions with a renewable energy policy, while we are looking at making it sustainable, while we are looking at reducing exploitation of tribal land, reducing destruction of ecology, like I mentioned, there are negative consequences to it as well. So how do you evaluate the trade-offs becomes an important question that we need to answer. That's where games can really play a role. Why can games really play a role is, remember I was earlier talking about quantifiable and tangible parameters. So typically, when we look at optimization methods or equilibrium methods, they start with a large solution space with quantifiable and tangible parameters, and they start narrowing down the solution space to arrive at what is the optimized or the most suitable solution. This is what happens in the first approach, when you are narrowing down the solution space. But when it comes to the kind of problems that we are looking at, unfortunately for us, what we need to do is also expand the solution space. We need to add in unquantifiable and intangible variables, simply because there are a lot of unintended consequences when we think about effects in interventions in the context of public policy, right? So that becomes something that needs to, sorry, just looking at the chat, there were two questions. Yeah, Eric, I'll just get to that in the very end, because I feel, unfortunately or fortunately, many people sort of forget that modeling is a critical element of creating gaming simulations as well. I would actually argue that without any form of substantive modeling, the efficacy of gaming simulation as a method reduces drastically. So I'll come to that a little later, Alec. Thank you for the question. It's a fairly important question. And Leon, do you recommend? Oh, tons of literature. We can talk about it later, Leon. There's a lot of literature in gaming simulation, at least. So yes, I was talking about how do we expand the solution set and why do we need to expand the solution set? When we start using only quantifiable and tangible parameters, we're not able to identify, as a very simple example, right? What I often give people as an example is when mobile telephony had just come into India, the cost of each call was very, very high. So what people started creating or doing is adapting to the fact that the cost is very high. So people started creating a code language. I'm not sure. I'm sure some of the people here in the panel would at least know about the fact that we started developing a language of missed calls. If I gave you one missed call, it meant that I am going to meet you at the designated time. If I gave you two missed calls, it meant I will not meet you at the designated time and the meeting is called off. If I gave you three missed calls, it probably meant we'll see you tomorrow or I'm going to be 10 minutes late, right? So this is how people adapt. People's preferences change. Or for the or another very simple example is in the context of Bangalore, when the first set of metro was really built, there was a very low uptick for this metro, the stretch of the metro. Now, it could have been preempted fairly easily if people's preferences and biases were included in the consultation process of designing the routes and therefore then coming up with what are the interconnected portions that are required when it comes to the metro. Simply put, in the context of metro, it had no interconnection with buses, which were the primary mode of transport for a large portion of the city. At that point in time, roughly, sorry, I'm just converting from lakhs to millions. 5.5 million trips was what the city bus service provided for the city of Bangalore at that point in time. We are talking about for a population of roughly 14 million people. So 5.5 million trips daily, right, was what the bus was catering to at that point in time. So the metro definitely could ease the burden and congestion, but because it wasn't designed well, it took a lot of time for it to sort of reach the potential that it could, which it still hasn't, by the way. So that's for another day. But that's why you need to bring in unquantifiable and intangible elements. So you can start testing the policy, you can start testing the formulation and see if the trade-offs make sense. If they don't make sense, will there be an uptick for this kind of a policy, or will people just not care about the policy, right? I've talked about this, I think, at ISAGA itself when it comes to gaming simulations. I'll run through the next few slides quickly just to go over some examples so that it becomes easier to contextualize what I've talked about. But one of the things that many people talk about when it comes to gaming simulations are magic circles. It's my pet peeve to talk about the fact that they don't exist when you're using them outside of just classroom learning. Simply because there is a relationship between different people outside of the game session as well. And when you start talking about the fact that it's a magic circle and they feel safe in these games, then the question also is how useful are the results outside of the game, right? If they're going to behave differently in the game than how they behave in the real world, how useful are these results when you're using the game for analytical purposes? And like I said, when people are not going to respond in a useful manner, or how do you incentivize people to respond in a useful manner becomes an important question. That can be done in a few ways. We've talked about this in that rather long presentation a few months ago. Happy to discuss this again in case there are questions. But the idea is that how do you create structures within games? How do you design assets within games that allow for disagreements when power structures are fairly high? So if I disagree with my boss in a game, and if I'm going to lose my job the next day, or if I'm going to be reprimanded the next day, I have very little incentive to disagree with my boss in the game, right? So how do you account for such differences in the context of the game and the outside? Or for example, if I'm playing one of the games that we built was a game on waste management, if it is seen as a good thing to be conservative about spending on waste, or if it is seen as a good thing to recycle, and the game gives me points to recycle, I will behave in that manner in the game. But in the real world, I might not do any of those actions. I might not take any of those actions. So how do you then sort of design games in a manner in which they actually replicate real world behavior? Where does the game fit again? Typically in such context, I think this is again fairly well known, so I'll just jump through it. We are looking at a briefing process, a gameplay process, and a debriefing process. Here, typically in pedagogical context, the observer and the co-facilitators are not very critical. But when we're using the results of the game for analytical purposes in terms of analyzing the trade-offs in the policy, or reformulating the policy, or testing the policy formulations in itself, then we need to have these observers and co-facilitators in order to ensure that the data that you collect is reasonably useful. So the idea is that linear cycle that we have, where is that linear cycle? Yeah, sorry. This linear cycle that we have, we sort of open it up to a certain extent to make it non-linear a little bit, to make it a little more cyclical with the use of different games and tools. So essentially, the question we need to ask is, can we use a game once we have arrived at what we think is the problem? When we get there, a few thumb rules or heuristics that really help is in the context of public policy. Is there any conflict because of differing goals or objectives? We talked about different stakeholders and how they have conflicting objectives. In this context, do such stakeholders exist? If they do, what is the conflict caused by? Is a useful thing to start with. Are there different outcomes? For example, if you've already decided that there is a bridge that is going to be built, I don't think it makes sense to use a gaming simulation to test that hypothesis anymore, because the outcome has already been predetermined. It would help before the outcome has been determined to actually ask that question. Sorry, I'm just looking at questions again. Sorry. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Vilwile Enari. So just a quick comment on what you've stated. Insecurity is fairly easy to model and build in. Fear is, again, contextual, how you build in and how you bring that in into the setting of the game in itself. And unless we have good facilitators, handling fear is much harder. Insecurity is fairly easy because, like I said, we're thinking about the modeling aspect. There are ways to model that because you're mimiking real-world processes, which can be measured, quantified, and the effects of those insecurities have been fairly well established in today's context. So we have a lot of literature to build on. But in the context of fear, we've stayed away from bringing in fear, primarily because then you need really experienced facilitators to be able to handle the interaction between different players then. Yeah, Eric, you're right. I mean, safety is also a fairly large word, but when people start participating, actually, what happens in the context of games is, depending on how we've modeled the context, either there is complete buy-in from the players. So as soon as we start, they're gung-ho, they're ready, they're excited, they want to start playing the game. Or if they don't like the model, right? I'll give you one example. In one of the games that we had created, which was about energy planning, it was fairly in-depth. You had numbers like 3.34 rupees per kilowatt hour. You had 55,000 tons that was required. So a lot of numbers that you need to juggle, right? You're creating the energy plan for the country. Now, this particular game was a big hit with bureaucrats and energy planners themselves. They loved the game because the model of planning and the model of energy was very close to what they follow on a day-to-day basis. So they were able to appreciate that and feel quote unquote safe, like we talked about earlier, right? To participate in the game. But when the same game we played with a bunch of artists, they hated and abhorred the game completely. Because for them, the numbers were overwhelming. They did not make any sense in the long term. A simple dial and a knob would have helped them actually come up with a plan much more easily, because for them, it was about stakeholder expectation matching. What I need as the Minister for Petroleum and what you need as somebody who's representing the coal lobby is substantively different, right? But it's about negotiating that space. So the artists were entering it from that angle, right? So who the audience are, therefore, becomes critical when we are modeling the game itself, right? With obviously different fidelities. The same game with changing the fidelity of the model to a certain extent would have worked well with artists as well. That's one element when it comes to safety. The other element is in the playtesting. I think, Eric, we've talked about this a long time ago as well. In when it comes to sort of playtesting or creating games for the right audience, one of the critical elements also is power structures, right? And the energy game was a good example of that. When we played the energy game, where there were a lot of repercussions, especially in the first design of the game, there was room to disagree. I could disagree with you, Eric. I could disagree with you, Vinod, in the context of the game based on the roles we were playing. But what we didn't realize is the people playing the game had a huge difference in power. I was playing with my boss. I could also be playing with my boss's boss. So what that meant is I couldn't openly disagree. So the plans are not coming out very well because I wouldn't disagree with my boss or my boss's boss because I don't want to be reprimanded tomorrow in the office. So the results that we were looking for from the exercise, from the gaming simulation didn't really come out. Then when we went back and modified the game to account for the fact that there is this power differential and that idea of safety does not necessarily come through. I think this is the other question. I think Elizabeth also had this question. The idea of safety doesn't come through. So how you design the game for disagreements not to necessarily be open and explicit about the fact that I'm disagreeing with you. Hey, Vinod, I'm disagreeing with you. Hey, Eric, I'm disagreeing with you. Hey, Elizabeth, I'm disagreeing with you. Rather, it could be done in a much more culturally nuanced manner, helped actually achieve the objectives of the game. All right. So that's where I think how you design games in terms of safety and the magic circle comes in a little. Sorry, getting back to this slide, because we were talking about differing goals and objectives, I just had to bring that in. The last point here is, what is the conflict a result of? Is it because of the lack or limited resources that exist, or is it because of differing goals or objectives, right? Because then how you set up the game changes substantively. Limited resources or resource pool problems are a whole class of problems in itself. And addressing them is fairly easy. The kind of roles you would require to address them can be at different power levels. It does not really matter anymore. But when it comes from different goals and objectives, then if future end goals are not going to be similar, then because power structures are going to influence the outcome in the game, then you also need to account for that within the context of the game. Because otherwise, I don't have bargaining power, right, to get to the end goal that I want. If I don't have bargaining power to get to the end goal I don't want, or rather I want, then I lose interest in the game very quickly, right? So again, the use of the game or the utility of the game reduces drastically because we're not able to test different trade-offs there. A very, very not so short summary is in terms of theoretical processes, when it looks at modeling and public policy, we are looking at a few assumptions, right? We're looking at assumptions of equilibrium. We're looking at homogeneity. We're looking at discontinuity. We're looking at a small set of quantified strategy sets. Whereas what we sort of need, whether it's theoretical or in the empirical context, feedback loops are missing. We talked about the flattening of the policy cycle, right? Because of the flattening, feedback loops become missing. There is also very simplistic behavior that is brought in, right? In order to avoid that is where you can start using gaming simulations to bring that out in its richness. A few examples that I thought I can end with before we open the floor for the further questions. I talked about the energy game. On the left-hand side are Indian administrative officials who were playing the energy game in the context of India. And as you can see, when Eric, you were asking about how safe is the environment, right? So as you can see, when they started off the game, they were not really happy about the game in itself. These are people with 10, 20, 30 years experience in the civil services. You're asking them to sit and play a game. Games culturally are child's play in India. So you are asking them to play a game. They're not very happy about it. But as you can see, as the game progressed, they've abandoned their posts. They've moved to one computer or two computers. Their jackets are off. Their ties are off. Sleeves are rolled up. And they're having an intense conversation of what is the plan that they'd like, right? So you can create a valid model. This is where I think you were asking earlier about the modeling element of it, right? So if the model is useful, one aspect of any model that we use in a game is the fidelity of the model. The other aspect is the appropriateness for the target audience. So as you can see on the right-hand side, there are two images. The one on the left is a board game on waste management with waste workers in the city of Bangalore. So the model fidelity is fairly high, but how that is implemented in the game is abstracted out to such an extent that anybody can play the game. You don't need anything beyond numerical literacy to play the game. So you see them actually playing on the street game on waste management, decentralized waste management in the city. If you look at the game at the bottom, we're playing with abstract tokens like paper cups. This is with civil servants in Sri Lanka that we were running this exercise. In all these contexts, they were negotiating different futures through a gaming simulation. Again, similar paper cup exercise with two sets of school children in Mysore and Bombay, in two other parts of India, in Karnataka and Maharashtra. And on the right-hand side is actually in Haarlem in Netherlands, where they were coming up with a plan to reorganize their municipal budgets using a similar exercise. So they were envisioning budget expenditure in a similar exercise in Haarlem. Interestingly, even the mayor of Harlem was excited about doing this at scale. Again, evaluation of policies. This is again abstracted out. This is in the context of pastoralism and various acts that the government had brought in at that point in time, looking at rights for pastoralists or reconfiguring the pastoral land, because there was a classification issue at that point in time, which has become even worse right now in terms of calling something as wastelands when they're not actually wasteland, or even calling them as fallow land when they're not actually fallow land. This was evaluating trade-offs between different formulations of the policy and then saying, this is something that I would like and this is something that I wouldn't like. Here, the model fidelity is fairly low and much more abstracted out because of the target audience and the facilitation process. We needed low touch point for facilitation, not highly experienced facilitators in this context, right? Again, this is trade-offs. These are economists playing a game on achieving SDGs and specific SDGs in the context of education and health. And how can they achieve those SDGs? Again, in this context, highly quantified, they had about 250 parameters that they had to look at in order to come up with a future scenario. And they played for a period of 20 years. So it was almost like a macroeconomic model that was running in the background. I already talked about the waste management game. Here are some more game sessions. The image on the top is waste workers in the city of Chennai who were actually evaluating whether a decentralized waste management plan will work or not. And the image on the bottom left is a civil society organization that works on livelihoods and waste. And interestingly, the only people who were able to successfully create a policy on decentralized waste is waste workers themselves, not civil society organizations who work on waste, not academics who work on waste, but actual people who work with waste, right? Who work with waste with their hands. So these were the only people who successfully ever drafted a policy in that context, right? Or evaluated a policy in that context. Again, looking at various futures, one of the challenges with any kind of scenario where you have multiple stakeholders with differing objectives is what's the future that I would like and why would I like that future? So in the context of this game, the people who are wearing the masks are playing the role of garment workers. And the people who play this game don't have the necessary context to be a garment worker. They don't understand the context. Which is why we sort of, to get them to understand, again, this is another pet peeve of mine in gaming simulations, is our hypothesis when using these games in the public policy context is role play does not necessarily help people get closer to the role or become that role. If they're playing the role of X, do they become the role of X? Rather, it helps them appreciate how far away they are from X. So if they're playing the role of a garment worker, how far away am I as a garment worker? Or how removed am I from the role of a disaster first responder in the context of a disaster? So that's what it helps people appreciate. So in this context, what they also see, what labels you see on the masks are a result of data that came from a survey that was conducted in 2010, 11, 12 of urban settlements in Bangalore, and with garment factory workers themselves later on. We use that data to create these personas that they play, and they essentially then start negotiating which future is acceptable, and if that is future is acceptable. So the reason you have those steps and those slates at the ground is if a certain accepted future is something that they all agree on, is that useful to everybody, right? We were talking about the fact that it's about trade-offs. So you see already they're at different levels. You have two people in step 2, one person in step 3, and one person still in step 1. So even when you agree on a certain future, it affects each of us differently, was what I wanted to bring through. This is the context of transport planning. I wanted to give you 2 examples. One was, Eric, the question that you had asked, and I think if I remember correctly, sorry, just opening chat. Elizabeth also asked about the fallacy of the magic circle. So I just wanted to bring in talk about that very briefly with these 2 examples. The first one is fairly straightforward. This was an exercise that we did with government officials on planning, on city planning routes with the public bus transport company. And they were essentially coming up with different plans that will help BMTC, which is the public bus company in Bangalore, run routes that were, even though they were seen as loss-making routes, right? Again, they thought it was essential that these routes run because they served a very particular need of the community that was affected by these routes. If those routes were removed, that community did not have access to livelihoods otherwise. So they were talking about how it's important to bring in. So this was the unquantifiable intangible that I was talking about earlier, right? There is a preference to ensure that everybody has access to these services, despite the fact that the quantified metric that is often used is loss. Or efficiency of the route, right? How efficient is that route? So they actually moved away from conventional wisdom that transport or transit planners often use to come up with these plans for redistributing or reorganizing the bus routes. Now, the same game we also played with civil society organizations, where the idea was not to create the same output, but to validate the plans that the government is creating. And also to get this is where some amount of bridging can happen, right? So one of the demands of the civil society organizations at that point in time was double the fare, or sorry, double the, not the fare, sorry, double the number of buses and reduce the fare by half. That was their demand at that point in time. But when they started playing the game, they understood the trade-offs themselves, and they said doubling the number of routes and reducing the fare by half is not feasible for this government body. What is a more acceptable trade-off? And that is the starting point for the negotiation between the different parties then. So then it becomes easier to have a conversation. It's not we are sitting across the table to shoot each other down kind of a conversation necessarily. So this was created in order to have that dialogue between the different stakeholders. I think I am done before we open. Yes, I am done. Thank you. Any questions? Shall close. I shall stop sharing. Yes.
There are questions in the chat box as well as in Q&A also.
I'd really like to take up the issue of the fallacy of the magic circle. I don't understand what you mean by it. Or maybe ask the question the other way. What do you mean by the magic circle, and why would you see it as a fallacy?
A few things, Elizabeth, actually. I'm using the standard definition that has been in one of the previous sagas. I had actually made a presentation about where does the concept of magic circle come about. in the context of gaming simulations, and how is it being used? So the working definition I presented there was the idea that once people step into the game, they think or conceptualize of the game as a safe space to be able to behave in a manner in which their responses are not tainted necessarily by repercussions in the real world. So that's
Okay.
the definition that is used.
Then I guess this will be part of a longer conversation, because that's not how I define the magic circle.
Yeah. So I guess that's where I think a lot of discomfort comes in when it comes to gaming simulations as well. Different people tend to use the concept of magic circle itself very, very differently.
Yeah. And that's one thing I'd love to see more of, is working out ways to actually, I don't know, to transgress, cross over those definitions.
Yeah.
Or share them.
Yeah.
Because for me, the magic circle is kind of an invisible line, and when people step into the simulation, it's not necessarily going to be safer, but it is unreal, as in it's not reality. And that's for me the marking point of the magic circle. Yeah, and so I can see Eric saying no. So what are you thinking of, Eric?
Sorry, Eric, just before you go ahead. So the definition that you use often is also the definition that's used in the commercial games context, actually, Elizabeth. Sorry, Eric, go on. You were going to respond.
I'm following the Thomas theorem. That means what it's real in the situation and real for your people in the situation, then it's real also for reality. So you feel like someone who is dealing with coal industry and something like this. And I think out of this feeling and out to recognize the figures around this industry, you are able to take this with you for the decisions or behavior in the real world. So I like the Thomas theorem, in fact.
Yes. So I think, just going back to your question, Eric, again about the modeling, right? I think in the context of public policy, creating these models becomes very, very critical. What is the fidelity of the model that we then use in the gaming simulation? Like I said, would be based on a few factors. One is who the target audience is. If the target audience is, as I mentioned in the examples, somebody who's used to a lot of data, then you change the fidelity of the model to suit that. If the target audience is somebody who's only comfortable with numerical literacy and abstraction, then you change it to that extent. The reason to do this is actually primarily because the results have to be then fed into the policy-making process. So because we're using it to either test a policy, evaluate a policy, or do a needs assessment, right? To understand what would be useful for these particular stakeholders. So bringing in a valid model, a so-called valid, I'm using quote unquote again, because not everybody validates their models either, whether it's for a gaming simulation or otherwise, right? So you validating or having a verifiable model becomes useful, because then the results can be replicated to a certain extent. Because again, assembling the same set of stakeholders who are going to behave in the same manner the next time is a whole can of worms for another time. But the idea is you provide for a reproducible environment. That's the reason, Eric. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And just let the space for other questions. I would have some additional ones, but...
Hi, Bharat. This is Jiga here.
Hello.
Hello. Nice to meet you. I have this question. I would like to ask you about when you talk about fidelity and creating simulation for real life situations and all that. What are the common blind spots? Because sometimes we only realize this as we go on. But if there is any rule of thumb for us to find out, or is it just through testing you find your blind spots, or what are the common blind spots to look out for?
Jiga, nice question. I can see it comes from a very practitioner's approach as well, because of what we encounter on a daily basis. But a few things, right? I think the first one is in terms of the process of creating such a gaming simulation itself. If we start using a more iterative approach rather than a staggered approach, where we are constantly play testing either with the target audience or with a specialized group that validates the model. So typically when I create these games, I test it with 3 different groups. One are people who are experts in the game design concept or the process of making games. The second is people who are subject matter experts, who are necessarily understand the problem space very well, because they then validate the model for us. And the third is the intended or the target audience. Because then we also understand to a large extent where does it work, where doesn't it work. So that's procedurally in terms of trying to cover some blind spots to a certain extent. Then in terms of a few steps that we follow, right? A few steps that I have held us in good stead. The first one is when I was mentioning the heuristics of conflict, right? That's a very critical element that people tend to forget in such gaming simulations. Conflict, how you create a game for a conflict between actors has to be modeled very differently when it is actually conflict that is stemming from resources or limited resources or scarce resources. Because the player's objectives could be aligned in the context of scarcity of resources. Whereas in the other context, their player objectives themselves are not aligned, right? So it's a very minor change, but a very important one when we're creating these game models themselves. The next one that we tend to look at is one of the things that I think gaming simulations could learn fairly well from the entertainment world is user research. We don't do as much or as much as user research that we should do to create more useful games for our users. Because there is a substantive amount of literature already there that we could borrow on to help us understand who the target audience are so that it works well with them. The final one, the last one that I keep stressing on, which is related to my pet peeve of Magic Circle, is the real world consequences for the players. If we are not cognizant of that when we are creating our games, then we have a slight problem when we run these game sessions, Jagar.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? There's somebody's hand up again, so I just wanted to check.
Yeah. Yeah, Mr. Bharat.
Yes.
Sampath here. I will ask you only one question. Whether multi-criteria optimization and Pareto optimization are same?
I mean, the end goal with multi-criteria optimization is not necessarily defined in the process that we think about when we talk about Pareto optimization. In Pareto optimization, it's the process. It's not how many parameters that we are often referring to, right? In multi-criteria, we're talking about the fact that it is different parameters that we want to optimize for. So there is a difference, A, in how we are doing it, and B, what we are approaching for. Sorry.
Okay. And one more thing, when you are doing multi-criteria optimization, suppose there is no preference, what you will do? Conflicting objectives are there.
Sampath, if I may, actually, a lot of multi-criteria optimization models that exist, preferences are not necessarily given, if you notice. Yes, there is some amount of prioritization that needs to happen when there is a clash when you're optimizing. But that prioritization can also be runtime. It doesn't have to be predefined. There are quite a few models that work on that principle.
So suppose there is no preference, also we can use multi-criteria analysis.
Of course. Yeah, there can be runtime or on-demand prioritization. It's not necessarily preferences that are used.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Eric, you had one more question.
Yeah, about one point just came to my mind. When you're working with real participants from the administration and so on, and they're also very interested in the results of the simulation games. So there's sometimes a problem in my situations how to documentate the process of the game and also the debriefing after the game, because these people, when they are jumping into the simulation games and it fits their needs, they're really, really interested in to work further on with the results or the kind of results. And on the other hand side, when you have a too close documentation, then you're destroying a little bit, or there's a danger to destroy the game. So how you deal with this situation or this effort?
So we learned this lesson the hard way, actually. One is in when such cases are there, one of the things we often end up doing is asking the participants, would they like to continue to use the game as an ongoing process? So what that then does is tells us that we don't necessarily have to be involved in the process going forward. So then what that also means is the facilitation skills that are required drops drastically. Because not everybody is an experienced facilitator. So what we then do is, as part of the game design process itself, tweak the game in such a way that whether it is in terms of artifacts that they're using, digital or physical, in terms of the artifacts that they're using, they tend to give the data that is required as part of the evaluation process. Or another thing that we also tend to do is look at where the results need to fit in. In some contexts, the results can fit in with some amount of pre-processing. In some contexts, the results need to be analyzed further for it to be useful in their context. So there we tell them, you give us the results after you run your session yourself, then we will analyze the results for you and give it to them. That's another element. And the third element is a trickier negotiation because one of the challenges in such a context is also if the results are not something that are, let's say, the results that people are looking for, right? So that's always a challenge. So I think in when we know that is the context going into the problem, we do not do the first model, which is hand over the game in itself to different people. Because then it becomes very tricky and it becomes unethical in terms of the use of the tool in itself. So then we say either us or a third party will continue to be involved in that process, or we involve a third party, even if we are not involved, we involve a third party in analyzing the results so that there is some amount of integrity maintained when it comes to looking at the results in the long term. But some of it also, over a number of games that we've created, we've also realized we can start creating the game design process itself has to change for when it's about embedding in certain processes, because the structural mechanisms of those processes need to be used for the game as well. You can't create a game outside of that context. Any other questions? And Leon, you'd asked about other reading material. I'm happy to share them with you. Please just send me an email. I'll be happy to share those reading material as well.
Any more questions?
We're spot on time.
Got us to a stop. Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Any more questions? I can see one more hand is raised. Okay. So now as we come to the end of the webinar, I now request Dr. Anand Rajawat, Dean Academics SVVV, to propose word of thanks.
Thank you, Aditi. A very good afternoon, good morning to all. At the outset, we express our sincere gratitude to Mr. Bharat M. Palavali, Ashoka Fellow, Bengaluru, India, for accepting our invitation to conduct the 57th webinar of the series, Pratiti Becoming Aware. We are also thankful to the International Simulation and Gaming Association, ISAGA, for the collaboration and support in the organization of Pratiti-2024 Becoming Aware webinar series. We express our sincere gratitude to Dr. Upinder Dhar, Honorable Vice Chancellor, and Dr. Santosh Dhar, Rector and Dean of SVVV, for their continuous guidance and encouragement. Our sincere thanks to all the panelists present and all the participants who make this webinar successful. Last but not least, I am also thankful to Dr. Aditi Veda and all the members of COE-SG as well as IT team of the university for their kind support. Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you, sir. So I request all the participants to please fill the feedback form mentioned in the chat box to get your e-certificates. We'll be soon meeting again with the next webinar. Thank you once again for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
And
you. Thank
just
you to
to,
all. Thank
before
you
you
for
end, I think Elizabeth had a very interesting one. It'll be great to talk about Magic Circle at some point later with everyone. That'll be
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah. We will.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Bharat.
Thank
Thank you, Bharat.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat. See you soon.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.